Section 25 of the Golden Web by Phillips OPPENHEIM. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Book 2, Chapter 4, A Question. Winifred came slowly into the room. It seemed to Deane, watching her curiously, that she had been steeling herself to defiance. There was no change in her expression, and her lips seemed tighter drawn than ever. She went at once to her brother's side. "You have been talking too much, Basil," she said. "You know that it is not good for you." He leaned across to the little table which stood by his side and helped himself to brandy. He was indeed looking terribly ill. The lines under his eyes seemed traced with a coal black pencil, and his hand shook so that half the brandy was spilled. "Winifred," he said, "I must ask you a question. You remember that I spoke to you of a document. Sinclair had it. I was trying to deal with him, trying to get it back from Mr. Deane here." "Yes," she answered calmly. "I remember you speaking of it." "We have reason to believe," he continued, gasping a little, "reason to believe that it has been stolen. Mr. Deane wants to know whether at any time you have mentioned its existence to anyone." She looked at Deane and back at her brother. Her face was unchanged. "No," she said, "I have mentioned it to no one." "You see," her brother continued, "it is like this. No one but I knew of that paper. Deane here told me, and I told no one except you, and yet we have evidence. We know that it has been stolen from Sinclair's room since his death. That is why we want you to be quite sure that you did not mention its existence to anyone." "No mention of it has crossed my lips," she answered. "I have no friends, no confidants. I have spoken to no one about it. Nothing in the world," she continued, "would be more improbable than that I should have done so." He turned to Deane, who stood by with an impassive face. "You hear?" he exclaimed. "You hear? I was quite sure about Winifred. She doesn't go talking about. She's no gossip, are you, Winifred?" "I hope not," she answered. "I have no reason, I am sure," Deane said slowly, "to doubt Miss Rowan's discretion." She raised her eyes for a moment and met his. The faint satire in his tone was intentionally provocative, but it failed to move her. Her regard of him was entirely impersonal. He looked away with a light shrug of the shoulders. "Well, Rowan," he said, "it seems there is nothing further to be done. If the paper does turn up," he added, "I shall know how to deal with its holder. In the meantime, about yourself." Rowan laughed a little hysterically. "About myself?" he repeated. "That's a fruitful subject, isn't it?" "Doctors make mistakes sometimes," Deane said. "Let us hope that they may have made one in your case. Anyhow, there is no reason why you should not be comfortable and have the best medical advice. Go where you think best, and send me your address. I shall not forget that your accident took place when you were engaged upon my affairs." "You are very good, Deane," Rowan said. The girl looked up. "Mr. Deane's kindness is quite unnecessary," she said. "We are in no want of money." "Your sister does not quite understand," Deane said, turning to him. "We have been through too many rough times in Africa together to stand upon ceremony now. You will perhaps be able to explain to her later on." He took up his hat and turned toward the door. "I shall expect to hear from you," he said, "as soon as you have decided where to go. Either from you, Rowan," he added, shaking hands with him, "or from your sister." "You are very kind, Deane," Rowan said. "I'm sorry I have made such a mess of things." "It was not your fault," Deane answered. "Good day, Miss Rowan." She looked at him for a moment, but she did not offer to take his outstretched hand. He smiled and withdrew it at once. "Good day, Mr. Deane," she said. The door closed behind him. Rowan was watching his sister anxiously. "Winifred," he said, "what is the matter with you? You were scarcely civil to Mr. Deane." "Oh, I think I was," she answered. "In any case, we don't want to take alms from him, do we?" "It isn't exactly that," Rowan objected. "It is." "He can afford it," Rowan declared. "He's very rich. £1,000 to him is like sixpence to us." "It doesn't alter facts," she rejoined. "I do not like Mr. Deane, Basil. It is through him that this trouble has come upon us. You have taken enough of his money." "And when I am gone," he asked, "what about you then?" "Have I ever failed to make my own way?" she asked quietly. "I shall be safe enough, Basil." He commenced to cough, and very soon further speech was impossible. He was painfully exhausted. She sat by his side until he went off to sleep. Of his hopeless state there could no longer be any doubt. He was wasted almost to a shadow. Even in his sleep his breath came heavily and a fever seemed upon him. She stole softly from his side and stood for a few minutes at the window looking out. Below, the pulse of the great world was beating with the same maddening regularity. The stream of wayfarers swept on. The roar of traffic was as inevitable as the waves of the sea. She stood by the window with small clenched hands. Behind her, his loud breathing seemed to beat out the time toward death. Deane himself was one of those wayfarers, but at least his thoughts, as he was being whirled eastward in his brougham, were fixed upon the tragedy which he had left behind him. He knew very well that it was not a question of months but of days with Basil Rowan. Was it only for that the girl was waiting? Her whole attitude toward him had about it a certain flavor of mystery which oppressed him. It was like trying to face an enemy hidden in a darkened room, listening for his footsteps, not knowing whence the blow might fall. Notwithstanding the warm sunshine, he shivered a little as he descended from the carriage and entered his offices. Section 25.